Quentin Tarantino makes extremely violent movies. I'm sure if you ask some nerd who's gone to film school and knows what they're talking about, they'll tell you that this handful of Korean directors or Eli Roth make even more violent movies. But in terms of directors your dad has heard of, Tarantino's about as violent as it gets. But as much as he insists, the violence in his movies isn't just fun. He uses violence to craft cathartic, emotionally enveloping experiences. And prepare yourself for a real hot take coming from a 20-something-year-old white guy who went to art school. I think Tarantino is pretty neat. Which is why I was bummed to find that Once Upon a Time in Hollywood really didn't work for me. I've been racking my brain for almost 2 years trying to find out what it is about this movie that just doesn't land. And I think I finally cracked the code. Quentin Tarantino, the contemporary master of duplicitous, multifaceted film violence, got the violence wrong in this one. To be crystal clear up front, violence in movies doesn't need a deep point. Your characters don't have to be overthrowing an evil dictator for the punchies to be warranted. Now that's not to say there aren't gross uses of violence. The often trauma-inducing reliance on having women characters experience sexual assault in order to establish a bad guy comes to mind. But there are plenty of ways violence in movies can justify itself. It doesn't need to be thoughtful or mature. In fact, some of the best film violence is far from it. Planet Terror has a lady with a machine gun on her leg. This is peak cinema. Point is, violence in movies can take any number of forms it'd like and still manage to pump serotonin into my brain. All that being said, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood feels off. The violent altercation at the end of the movie feels sudden, unearned, and, pardon the pun here, it feels like a bit overkill. And I don't mean to say, it gave me a negative experience, so that means it was bad. I mean that it feels like it's going for a specific experience that it fails to deliver on. While violence can take whatever form it likes in a movie and, within reason, be fine, there is a certain kind of violence that I find really interesting. And it's what Once Upon a Time in Hollywood feels like it's going for, yet misses the mark on. That kind of violence, a subgenre if you will, is retributive violence. Simply put, when a character gets back at some baddies. Most action media tries to use some form of revenge to get the audience on board. It's why Double Dragon starts with the bad guys carrying your lady friend away. So you, the player, can feel personally invested as you go around punching and kicking the shit out of them. But the stakes we see in the subgenre we might call retributive violence get really deep and really personal. Sometimes it means lady goes around and kills all the men who sexually assaulted her. Other times it's a lady going around killing everyone who imprisoned her. It's a lot of ladies doing a lot of killing in this subgenre, if that's the thing that piques your interest. Either way, the stakes are through the roof. The violence is so immediate and personal to our characters, creating a uniquely visceral experience. The raw violence of these movies feel not only justified, but kinda good. While we're taught from a young age to shy away from violence, our protagonist is out here serving just desserts. So in these moments, we feel at our core the cathartic release these characters are experiencing. Tarantino, among other things he's known for, has made a career out of retributive violence in film. Death Proof, ladies beat up a serial lady murderer. Kill Bill, the title itself tells you it's about getting revenge on the guy that left her for dead. And I'm sure his other movies that I haven't gotten around to seeing yet have these elements mixed in too. Please don't cancel me, movie Twitter. But, in my opinion, Tarantino hit his retributive violence stride with two specific films. Django Unchained and Inglourious Basterds are some of my favorite movies, and they're possibly the best examples of retributive violence in film. So what is it about these movies that makes the violence so enjoyable? Good question, brain. Glad you thought of it. Part of the glee I feel watching Django or Bastards is who the violence is being done toward. Borrowing the language of comedy for a second, these movies quite literally punch up at some of the most despicable villains in history. The KKK, Nazis, slave owners, and even Adolf Elizabeth Hitler. Given the abject villainy of these groups, the audience rejoices as these absolute monsters get what's coming to them. Like, let's be clear, it's very cool and nice and fun to see Hitler or Klansmen get gunned down. Those moments get my stamp of approval. The excitement is heightened in the case of Hitler. The film is giving us a chance to celebrate his defeat in the explosive, bloody fashion his wretchedness deserved. But it's not just who the violence is being done to that's satisfying. The subjects performing the violence are equally a part of the catharsis. Django Unchained takes a character who's not only personally wronged by the slave owners in the movie, but reigns from a group systematically oppressed by the slave-owning class. It cannot go unmentioned that most of what makes Django so visceral is that it's a black guy murdering all these slave owners. Django's identity as an oppressed person is crucial to our experience. It could just as easily have been a well-meaning Anglo-Saxon Yankee that killed them all, but it wasn't. Not only because it would be less narratively gratifying, but because it would rob a black performer of the chance at narrative retribution, and by extension, would rob black people in the audience of their point of view experience. The cathartic release isn't just for a general audience. It has amplified relevance to the groups whomst are getting their revenge on screen. The same can be said of Inglourious Basterds. It's not just that Hitler gets gunned down, which again is quite neat. Part of the glee comes from the fact that he's murdered by 2 Jewish soldiers. On top of that, the Jewish lady whose family was murdered by Nazis in the opening of the film burns down the theater with the help of another victim of Nazi bigotry, a black dude. Like, as the theater and the Nazi scum in it are engulfed in flames, her movie literally yells out, "This is the face of vengeance."
Can I make it any more obvious?
Again, these identities are crucial, not just to a general audience's experience, but to the metatextual vengeance for the oppressed groups the characters reign from. It wasn't Brad Pitt's hillbilly ass that went around murdering the Nazis. It's mostly Jewish characters. The metatextual significance of the people these movies give a platform to is immeasurable. In each case, it's an oppressed class given the chance to brutalize their oppressors. For that reason, both these movies feel kinda like folklore, like a hero of local legend who protects their specific ethnic groups from the bigotry of their oppressors. In fact, back in 2009, The Atlantic referred to Inglourious Basterds as Hollywood's Jewish Avenger, which perfectly sums up the movie's larger-than-life and legend/folklore-like qualities. Also, if you read some of the pull quotes from Jewish critics and people involved in the movie in the Atlantic article, they all refer to the violence in really sexual terms. So from that, we can gather that it means a lot to the wider Jewish culture that these characters get to be so brutal to Nazis on screen. These films aren't just fun violence at random. It's violence targeted at a specific group, carried out by specific groups. And it's bloody great. With all that being said, let's return to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. At first glance, Tarantino's latest film seems to have the same retributive violence that made Django and Bastards so appealing. In real life, Sharon Tate was assassinated by order of Charles Manson. Plus, the beloved young star was killed while 8 months pregnant. It sent shockwaves through the film industry. In fact, many film historians cite her death as a shift away from the prestige of old Hollywood to the grittiness of the 70s. But, in typical retributive form, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood has the assassins thwarted, in a violent display that lets us bask in the retribution. The film changes history in order to narratively right this tragic wrong, much in the same way Inglourious Basterds did. And yet, something feels off. Like, to borrow a phrase from Naked Jacob for a sec, my childlike goopy goblin brain is stimulated by all the slick action and the visceral nature of the violence. But whether it's Leo with a flamethrower or this dog chomping away, it just doesn't hit the same. Somewhere along the line, my emotional connection to this action got lost. Now, in trying to pinpoint what doesn't exactly work in the ending, I could say it's this moment's relative obscurity that makes it less punchy. The other movies had quickly recognizable travesties, so it was easy to get behind the monsters being murdered. But Sharon Tate's death, while tragic, isn't exactly a history class staple. In fact, for whatever the anecdotal evidence is worth, I never even heard about her before the movie. So I could say, for that reason, the violence is harder to get behind, to emotionally connect with. Or I could say it's the pacing of the movie that keeps this moment from landing. That most of the film has been super slow up until this point, and then all of a sudden, bam, out of nowhere we get this short burst of violence. But those explanations are really just my relationship to this movie. I don't think they carry anything resembling objective weight, and I really don't think they get to the root of the problem here. At the end of the day, the final scene fails to work because the movie has ruined the formula for retributive violence. And I'll give one quick fix that would have done a lot of good. If the victims of the historical violence were, actually involved in retribution. If Sharon Tate and her friends were the ones doing the killing. If she could be the agent of her own salvation, that'd massively change the impact of the ending. It wouldn't fix some of my other issues with the movie, which are for another video, but at least it'd be a stronger ending. Sadly, we don't get that ending. We don't get Sharon Tate battling her way out of an unjust early death. Instead, we get Brad Pitt and Leo killing everyone. Oh, and Brad Pitt's cute dog. I guess we can't forget about him. These characters have no connection to Sharon Tate and are untouched by any targeted violence from the Manson family. And I know that while you're watching the movie, you get caught up in their storylines and it might feel like a payoff for their characters. But let's really think for a sec about what it means to rip the chance at retribution from the lady who was actually murdered. Like, imagine if Kill Bill was all about her neighbor getting revenge. If Django Unchained was about some white Yankee killing all the slave owners on Django's behalf. Or imagine if the soldiers and bastards weren't Jewish. The movies wouldn't carry the same weight. A core element of what makes the retributive violence so visceral would be erased. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood commits that cardinal sin. It takes the glory of revenge away from the lady who was wronged. But Once Upon a Time in Hollywood's crime is even one step worse than that. Even in those alternative plots I just listed, at least the characters would intentionally be getting revenge. Like, it'd be objectively more lame and blatantly whitewashing to have a well-to-do white Yankee kill all of Django's slave owners, but at least the guy would be targeting Django's oppressors. As cheapened as that story would be, we're at least allowed some visceral pleasure by way of Django asking him to kill them. But here, Leo and Brad Pitt don't even know what they're stopping. These folks just show up to the house and they kill him. There's zero intentionality behind thwarting the Manson family. It turns the ending into a matter of coincidence instead of an epic display of retribution. So yet another key component of the retributive violence equation is out of whack. On top of that, Margot Robbie's lack of character depth doesn't do the ending any favors either. To bust out the sexist card for a second, it's almost intentionally shitty to rob her of a chance to get revenge on her would-be killers while simultaneously turning her character into a cardboard cutout of a pretty lady. Like, at least give us one good part of the equation, Tarantino. I'll take bland lady who gets revenge, or interesting character who doesn't, over whatever this bullshit is. Margot Robbie just meanders through random scenes so the audience can fondly remember her and so she can put her feet up. Oh Lord, there are a lot of feet in this movie. So what's my point here? Why am I digging this deep into the formula of these violent movies? Because, while I generally don't like boiling art down to an equation, structure in art is important, especially with the specific emotional experience that is retributive violence. At its best, the subgenre offers compelling metatextual moments of revenge for oppressed groups of people, and in its more basic forms, it allows a cathartic release as its characters get to avenge some crime committed against them. But Once Upon a Time in Hollywood removes almost every element from the retributive violence that makes the subgenre so gripping. It robs the victim of the chance to get revenge. It robs the revenge of intentionality. And what it leaves us with feels like a hollow shell of what the subgenre can be at its finest. It no longer exists as a metatextual victory for an oppressed class, and it's not even a moment for a character in history to avenge themselves. At the end of the day, it's a weak, poorly motivated, disconnected excuse to have Leo flamethrower somebody to death. And to rob this glorious moment of the emotional weight it deserves should honestly be considered a war crime, if you ask me. Anyway, thanks for watching, everyone. If you want to help the channel out, the first thing you can do is toss me a like and subscribe down below. But if you really want to support me, you can join me over on Patreon. Patrons get access to behind-the-scenes content, early versions of every video essay, as well as exclusive videos, like this response segment I did about Cardi B and Dr. Seuss, or this Q&A video. So be sure to join me over on Patreon if you want access to all these exclusive goodies. Plus, if you join the Piley Benton's Biggest Boys tier, then you'll get your name read out at the end of every video, like Zoth, Sean Locke, Revo Pregame, Nilic Elites, Floof Pants, and Kerman Ferd. So be sure to join me on this specific tier if you'd like your name read off at the end of every video. Thanks much, everyone, and I'll see you next time.